Hi guys, this is Nia and today I have a chrysanthemum tutorial which was suggested by a couple of you. I've also been wanting to paint this flower, but it's a little bit tricky but doable, so let's just start by drawing it out first like usual. Chrysanthemum flowers have many layers, and this is the thing that might become a little bit complex, which is why it's better to break it down using pencil first. I like to start by drawing out a bulb which kind of look like an onion, and to do that I'm going to divide it into smaller and thinner petals. Then I try to build on the petals one at a time surrounding the bulb. But as you add on each new layer, I try to open up the petals a little bit more. When I draw the petals, I try to think about the shape of a very long teardrop, which could be bent and curved. For some of the foreshortened petals, which are covering the previous layers, you can just draw it right on top for now, so you don't have to worry about the previous layers and just use the previous layers as indication of where you should place the next petals. For each new layer, I tried to give a bit of space at the bottom to give it some room so the flower doesn't look flat. Try to always keep the roundness of the flower, so add the petals to balance and fill in the spaces. As I get towards the edges, then I try to add a few of the petals sticking out to give it some movement and airiness to the flowers. If this is still a bit difficult, you can try to do this a few times until you're comfortable. Then you can move on to the next step where you can now draw this with the proper layer without overlaying the previous layers. You can do this by studying the placement roughly from the previous drawings, and for the foreshortened petals I tried to make them look shorter but still in a slight angle or slight curve to follow the movement of the flower. You can also draw a flower that is opened up and bloomed completely at the center, but it is slightly more tricky than the previous one because there are more foreshortened petals, but the idea is basically the same. But for the center, I just make dots to represent the stamen of the flower, and as for the stem, I try to make this one rather thick so it can uphold the weight of the flower. Moving on to the leaves now, the leaves are quite big and the shape has more detail than ordinary leaves. But to break it down, I tried to think of it as a big leaf made out of smaller ones, one leaf at the top and two on either side, and I use this as a guide. Then I try to draw around it, making uneven jagged lines to give it a bit of a texture. Do this a few times until you find drawing the outline is comfortable enough, then try to go straight in with the leaf shape without using the guide. You can also draw this angled, but it might be a little bit more complex to visualize, but one way of approaching it is to draw a line as the midrib of the leaf and try to draw one side of the leaf, but instead of continuing to draw the other side, I add parts of the leaf popping out from the same side. You can also draw the leaf by itself, then make folds at the edges to make it look more natural. For the flower buds, you can either draw a small version of the flower that isn't as layered, or you can create the bulb or onion shape from before, followed by small leaves at the bottom of the stem. To draw out the smaller version of the flower, you can just do a few petals facing upwards that isn't as curved as the larger ones. You can also draw out a bowl shape, then fill it in with the thin petals if you would like to. Before you start painting this, you can try to practice using your brush by creating the curved lines where it's thicker at the end and thinner at the bottom, and practice curving them in different angles. It doesn't have to be done in one stroke. You can go over it again and clean out any of the lines because it might be a little bit difficult to get the soft edges at the end of the petals. Try to also paint different lengths and then placing them in the places as you've previously drawn them out, and keep practicing the strokes and placement until you are comfortable with it before tackling the painting. If drawing it out straight as a flower is a bit too difficult, you can always try to paint the different angles separately before compiling it together. To paint the leaves, I'm still going to paint it as I sectioned it before, but this time I'm going to then divide each section into 3. Then I'm going to connect them together as a leaf. You don't have to do this if you're able to visualize the shape, but I just find that doing this makes the step much easier to follow. Because the demo already took quite a while to show, I decided to go over the colors while painting it. In actuality, you're able to make other colors too since there are many different ones available, but I've chosen to paint a yellow and a pink one today, and for the first one I'm going to use a mix of yellow with a slight bit of vermilion to warm the yellow up. I'm using my Pentel colors here, so the colors are quite simple to follow, but like I mentioned, you can also create your own mixes. Depending on how big you want the flower to be, you can just keep adding more layers and then adjust according to the size of the page and composition. I like to start with quite a light flat wash to map out the petals roughly. So this can be a little bit tricky if you're not used to using really light colors because you will have a lot of water. So make sure before applying it that your brush is nice and pointy to see that it doesn't have too much water. But if you feel like your brush is overloaded, you can always dab the excess with some tissue. At this point, I try to also separate the petals because I want it to be quite clear for me to follow as I build on the layers. Notice that the petals are also smaller towards the middle, then I extend the petals as it blooms out. Don't forget to also vary the positions to give the flower some movement. If it's a bit difficult to visualize but you still want to paint this freehand, you could always draw it out on a separate page first, and you can use that as reference for the layers and for the foreshortened petals, so it's a little bit easier to follow rather than working straight on paper without having any idea to begin with, because that can be quite intimidating, especially if you're new to watercolors. I'm going to repeat the same thing with the pink mixture now, and for that I use the colors red, purple, vermilion, and also white mixed with a little bit of the yellow from the previous color, and this time I'm going to paint the flower that is fully opened so I'm able to see the stamen at the center. To paint this, I'm going to still use the same method, but this time I'm going to leave the center empty, making sure though that the empty space is a nice oval shape. Then I build on the petals just like before, with the petals smaller and shorter in the middle and then getting larger as I build towards the outside layers. Be mindful when you're painting this that the overall silhouette of the flower is still nice and rounded, or it can also have something like a rough onion shape, but you can go a bit random for the petals, which are right at the outside layer, because this is what gives it a little bit of movement to the flower. For the second layer of the chrysanthemum flowers, I'm going to go back to the yellow one first, and I'm going to add more red to the yellow to create more of an orangey tone. And this time I'm also going to use a thicker consistency so we can start to build on the colors. To do this, I'm going to add the darker tones in between some of the petals, especially ones where the petals are in front and mostly foreshortened. This will give a sense of dimension to the painting, and as I get towards the outside of the flowers though, I try to add less shadows, especially in the last layer where the petals are a bit more opened. I try to add the shadow near the areas which are close to the center of the flower, so where the petals are connecting with each other. You can also add more petals at the bottom behind the lighter ones that you've painted, and this will give the painting an extra depth and roundness. And then with the same orange color, I'm going to use this to paint the center of the second flower. And for that, I'm going to apply the paint by doing a dotting motion. I try to use less water so the paint doesn't puddle too much, because I still want to be able to see some of the white negative spaces in certain areas. Then I'm going to continue on with the same method as before, but this time I used a thicker consistency pink to define the petals. I just work slowly so I can get a bit more accuracy with the brush. I'm still using the same brush, but you can also switch to a smaller brush if you feel like you need more control. Next, I'm going to paint the flower buds. You can create this with either of the colors depending on where you want to attach them, or choose your own. But I'm just going to stick with the yellow for the first one, and I'm just going to do a rough placement of the petals to form the slight onion shape. Then I also took some green that I used from a mixture of light green and black to paint the stems. You can paint as many of the flower buds as you want to frame your main flower, or you can also fill in the other spaces with leaves. For this next one, I'm using the same yellow color, but I also added some of the pink on the outside. Then I just let them blend naturally, and this is something you can also do with yours by combining different colors while the paint is still wet. Next, I'm going to paint the stems, and as I mentioned before, because I am painting the flowers quite large, I'm going to paint quite a thick stem to balance out the weight of the flower, and basically the bigger you paint this, the thicker your stem would be. I'm going to show you how I paint the half-facing leaf. It's not too difficult, but it does take a bit of control. So I start by painting one side of the leaf with a stem that has a slight curvature so it doesn't look too stiff. I'm going to wait for this leaf to first dry, and I'm going to move on to paint the other leaf. And for this one, I'm just going to paint a straightforward one, like how I demonstrated it before, and you can play around with different sizes to make an interesting composition. Next, I'm also going to use a slightly thicker consistency of green to further line parts of the stem, and this should give more of a definition as well as volume to the stems to make it rounded instead of it being flat. This should also separate the two stems that I've got as separate objects instead of an infused silhouette. Getting back to the half leaf now that it's completely dry, I mixed a darker green color by adding more black, purple, and this time I also added ultramarine blue to the previous green color. Then I'm going to paint in between the leaves just like how I drew it out before, and this should give the illusion of the leaf slightly folded. Then I'm just going to add more leaves where I feel it's needed, and I also add a bit of detail to the leaves by painting some veins using my smallest brush. There are usually tiny leaves at the bottom of the flowers, so I'm just going to paint some. I think that this is a nice little detail that can add a little bit of life to the painting, and if there are any spaces you need filling, you can also add tinier buds with just the green color. Any space you need to fill, you can adjust it to the size of the element. So here I don't feel like I need to add larger elements, so I'm just going to add tiny buds, maybe with a little bit of the flower peeking through. Here I'm just going to add thinner, finer details on the stems by adding darker greens, and then I'm also going to clean out some of the edges of the petals with my small brush. So I'm going over the flowers again using darker tones that I used before, and I just make sure to get really fine lines at the edges so I can create clean, defined shapes even without using an outline. You can also increase the contrast on small areas. I chose to do that around the top of the flower and then the bottom where the flower is blooming out. And I also add very thin lines as a little bit of texture to the petals to finish everything off. For the yellow flower, I added a bit of purple to the mix to mute the yellow slightly because I felt like the shadow was turning the whole flower into more of an orange color, but this can also lessen the vibrancy of colors, so I'm using this very sparingly. So this is the finished painting. You can play around with the color and composition. Here I made a simple composition, but you can also keep repeating the flowers in different sizes, colors, and angles to fill a large page. Like this one as an example, I painted this one while I was practicing the method for this tutorial, and I also chose darker colors. I think it works well, so it's really up to you what sort of look you're going for. So that's basically it for this tutorial. This was a little bit of a long one, but I hope you guys enjoyed this one as well as the others. If you're still here after the long video, thank you so much for your support. Happy painting, and I'll see you at the next one. Bye!